In this incredible story, a homeless female veteran takes a bold stand by sleeping outside the Pentagon, demanding justice for herself and others like her. But when the Secretary of Defense recognizes her, everything changes. Will her courage spark the change so many veterans desperately need? Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from as we share this powerful story of resilience, justice, and hope. The early morning silence was broken by the rhythmic clicking of military boots against the smooth pavement. A Pentagon security officer made his rounds, his gaze sweeping across the grounds in practiced vigilance. It was during this routine patrol that he spotted the unusual sight, a huddled figure on the edge of the perimeter, wrapped in layers of mismatched blankets. Sergeant Emily Harper stirred slightly under the worn fabric, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a mix of alertness and exhaustion. She didn't flinch as the officer approached. Instead, she straightened her posture, the faint discipline of her military training still etched in her every movement. "Ma'am, you can't be here," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not causing any trouble," Emily replied calmly, her tone betraying neither defiance nor fear. She shifted her position, revealing a face lined with the weathered strength of someone who had seen too much. A laminated ID badge peeked out from her coat, a relic of her days as an Army sergeant. The officer hesitated, noting the badge and her resolute demeanor. "Are you military?" "Was," Emily corrected, her voice tinged with a quiet bitterness. "Army, 12 years. 2 tours in Iraq, Bronze Star, Purple Heart." Her words were delivered matter-of-factly, as if they held no more weight than a grocery list. The officer faltered, unsure how to respond. I need to report this," he said eventually. "Go ahead," Emily said, leaning back against the cold stone wall. "It's a public space. I'm not trespassing." Emily chuckled. As the officer stepped away to make a call, Emily allowed herself a moment to close her eyes. Memories flickered unbidden, sandstorms that bit into her skin like shards of glass, the deafening roar of artillery fire, the faces of comrades lost in the chaos. Those memories had been her constant companions, even as the world she returned to seemed to have no place for her. The sound of a camera shutter snapped her back to the present. A young man in a business suit, phone in hand, stood a few feet away, taking photos. "Hey, are you homeless?" he asked, his tone more curious than compassionate. Emily glared at him, her lips pressing into a hard line. "What does it look like?" she replied curtly. Oh, I didn't mean," the man began, but Emily cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Just move along," she said, her voice low but commanding. "I'm not a spectacle." The man hesitated before pocketing his phone and walking away, glancing over his shoulder as he disappeared into the growing morning crowd. Emily sighed, pulling her blanket tighter around her. She had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing the Pentagon represented the very system that had both shaped and abandoned her. From a nearby window, a Pentagon staffer observed the brief exchange, her brow furrowed in recognition, and she quickly picked up her desk phone. "Yes, this is Lisa in operations. There's a woman outside near the south gate. I think someone should come down. No, I don't know her name, but she looks familiar, military for sure." Meanwhile, Emily shifted her attention to the traffic beginning to swell on the adjacent highway. She studied the cars with a distant gaze, as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it, her focus instead on the small cardboard sign propped up beside her. It read, "Formerly inpatient and chronic want. Evicted by the immense forces of poverty." The security officer returned, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, someone from inside wants to speak with you. Please come with me." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "They didn't say," the officer admitted. "But it's above my pay grade to argue." For a moment, Emily considered refusing. But then she stood, her movements deliberate. She adjusted her layers, tucking her ID badge into her jacket as she squared her shoulders. "Lead the way," she said, her voice steady. As they walked toward the building, passers-by turned to watch, a mix of curiosity, judgment, and indifference in their eyes. Emily ignored them. She had spent too many years being invisible to care about the opinions of strangers. Inside, a chain of calls and hurried conversations buzzed through the Pentagon. The news of a homeless veteran protesting on their doorstep traveled quickly. At the end of one such call, a man leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening as he absorbed the details. "Sergeant Harper," Secretary of Defense Alan Marks murmured, recognition dawning. He stood, grabbing his jacket. "I need to see her." "Now." Emily, unaware of the storm brewing inside the building, followed the officer in silence. Her head held high, she walked with the steady purpose of someone who had nothing left to lose but her dignity. Emily Harper sat in the small waiting area just inside the Pentagon, her hands clasped tightly together. The silence pressed down on her like the weight of her rucksack from years ago, but her posture remained upright, disciplined. She was used to waiting, whether it was for the next deployment, the next medical appointment, or the next faint glimmer of hope in a world that had seemed to forget her. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the desert sands of Iraq. The memories were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. She could still feel the oppressive heat against her skin and hear the roar of Humvee engines cutting through the arid wasteland. Those were the days when she had a purpose, a mission, and a team that felt like family. "Sergeant Harper, we've got movement up ahead," Private Lyle had said, his voice tight with nerves. Emily adjusted her helmet, scanning the horizon through her binoculars. "Stay sharp, team. This route's been hit with IEDs before." The convoy moved cautiously, each vehicle spaced out to minimize casualties if the worst happened. Emily's hands gripped her rifle with a steady calm, her eyes darting between her surroundings and the jittery expressions of her younger team members. Then it happened. A deafening explosion rocked the lead vehicle, sending debris flying in all directions. Shouts filled the radio as Emily barked orders, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Take cover, return fire, medics on me." The firefight that ensued was a blur of smoke, adrenaline, and instinct. Emily moved with precision, dragging a wounded soldier behind cover while directing her team. Despite the chaos, she never wavered, even as shrapnel tore into her side. The mission was clear: secure the area, save her team, and make it back alive. Hours later, as the dust settled and the medevac choppers whisked away the injured, Emily stood among the ruins, blood staining her uniform. She had done what needed to be done, as always, but the cost, both visible and invisible, would haunt her for years to come. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, pulling Emily from her reverie. She clenched her jaw and glanced at the security officer standing nearby. He avoided her gaze, fidgeting nervously. She knew why. He wasn't used to seeing someone like her here, a veteran in the shadows of the institution she had once served. Now, the tension closed on top of her. "Command," Mademoiselle Inès declared. The past few years had been a gauntlet of struggles. Emily's transition to civilian life had started with promise. She had secured a job as a logistics coordinator, her military experience making her a natural fit. But the invisible wounds of war, the ones no metal could soothe, slowly unraveled her stability. Successful. First, it was the nightmares, vivid and relentless. Then the panic attacks in crowded spaces. By the time her employer let her go, citing performance concerns, Emily's marriage was already falling apart. Her husband had tried to be patient, but the weight of her trauma became too much for their relationship to bear. Without a steady income, her savings quickly evaporated. The VA was a labyrinth of red tape and waiting lists, leaving her without the medical care she desperately needed. By the time she lost her apartment, she was too weary to fight back. "I didn't fight overseas to end up fighting here," she had muttered to herself one night, staring at the eviction notice in her hand. The Pentagon was a symbol of everything Emily had once believed in: duty, honor, and service. But standing outside its gates earlier that morning, she couldn't shake the bitterness that had taken root in her heart. She hadn't come to beg. She had come to be seen. The government she had served had to acknowledge her existence, even if only for a fleeting moment. The sound of a door opening jolted her back to the present. A woman in a crisp suit entered the room, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Harper?" "Secretary Marks will see you now." Emily stood, her movements stiff. As she followed the woman down a long corridor, she caught glimpses of military officers and staffers going about their day. Some gave her curious looks, while others averted their eyes. It was as if they couldn't reconcile her disheveled appearance with the aura of the building around her. When she was finally ushered into a large conference room, Emily found herself face to face with Secretary of Defense Alan Marks. He stood behind a polished oak table, his gray hair neatly combed, and his posture radiating authority. "Sergeant Harper," he said, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and concern. "It's been a long time." "It's been a long time." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You remember me?" Marks nodded slowly, his gaze heavy. "I remember all my soldiers, especially the ones who served under me in Fallujah." Emily crossed her arms, her expression hard. "Then you know why I'm here." Marks gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "I'm here because this country failed me, and countless others like me. I'm not looking for a handout, Mr. Secretary. I'm looking for accountability." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mark studied her, his expression unreadable. "You have my attention, Sergeant. Tell me everything." Emily exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. For the first time in years, someone who mattered was willing to listen, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. Emily sat at the edge of her chair, her back ramrod straight, as she recounted her story. The conference room's cold, clinical atmosphere did nothing to soften her words. Secretary Marks sat across from her, his expression shifting between quiet guilt and intense focus. He wasn't just listening, he was absorbing every detail, from the hopeless waitlists at the VA to the nights she spent on the streets, clutching her duffel bag like a lifeline. "I gave this country everything I had," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with restrained emotion. "And when I needed it the most, I got nothing in return. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a VA office and be told to come back in 6 months for an appointment? To be treated like a statistic instead of a human being?" Marks nodded slowly, his fingers interlaced on the table. "I've heard similar stories, Sergeant, but hearing it from you, someone I served alongside, it makes it hit harder." "Stories." Emily leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "That's the problem, Mr. Secretary. To people like you, they're just stories. To us, they're our lives. You sign off on policies, budgets, and initiatives, but do you ever see where that money actually goes? Do you see the veterans sleeping under bridges or lining up at soup kitchens?" Marks held her gaze, unflinching. "You're right. I haven't seen enough. That's on me," Dr. Marks whispered. For a moment, Emily was taken aback by his candor. She had expected deflection, excuses, anything but an outright admission. But she wasn't here for apologies. She was here for action. Away from her life in China, she's developing a comprehensive plan, she demanded. 1. Marks exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Sergeant, I don't have an easy answer for you, but I can promise you this: your story won't end here. We'll start by getting you the help you need." Emily shook her head. "This isn't about just me. It's about every veteran out there who's been left behind." And then she sighed and helped Adam sit together. Mark studied her for a long moment, then reached for the phone on the table. "Lisa, get Get me the head of Veteran Affairs on the line, now." As Emily watched, Marks made calls with the precision of a man accustomed to commanding respect. Within minutes, the wheels of bureaucracy began to turn. Arrangements were made for immediate housing, medical care, and therapy for Emily. But she remained stoic, her arms crossed as she observed the flurry of activity. "This is a start," she said finally, her voice measured. "But it's not enough." Mark set down the phone and looked at her. "Then tell me, what would be enough?" Emily hesitated, then stood, pacing the room. "A real commitment. More than promises and press conferences. If you're serious about change, then use my story. Use it to shine a light on the system's failures. Bring real accountability to the people who claim to serve us." Marks considered her words. "That's a heavy ask, Sergeant." "Not as heavy as losing comrades because they couldn't get the help they needed," she shot back. "You're in a position to do something most of us can't: make people care." The secretary leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully. "You're not wrong, and, if you're willing, I'd like you to stand with me when we announce this." "Deh," Emily frowned. "A task force," Mark said, his tone firm. "A coalition of veterans, policymakers, and advocates to address the systemic issues you've outlined. And I want you on it." Emily's eyebrows rose. She hadn't expected this. "Why me?" Mark smiled faintly. "Because you don't mince words, and you've got the fire we need to make people listen. Plus, no one can call you a bureaucrat or accuse you of being out of touch. You're living proof of the problem." Emily was quiet for a moment, weighing his words. Her instinct was to distrust grand gestures, to assume this was just another hollow promise. But something in Marks's tone, perhaps the faint trace of the officer she'd once respected, made her hesitate. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I won't be your poster girl. I'll speak the truth, even if it makes you or your colleagues uncomfortable." Marks chuckled, the sound dry but not unkind. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Before Emily could respond, the door opened, and Lisa re-entered with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Secretary, the press is asking about the situation outside. Do you want to issue a statement?" Marks glanced at Emily. "What do you think?" She raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me?" He nodded. "This is your story, Sergeant. How do you want to tell it?" Emily thought for a moment, then said, "Tell them the truth. A veteran slept on the steps of the Pentagon today because she was abandoned by the system she served, and now that system has a chance to make things right." Lisa hesitated, then nodded, retreating to draft the statement. Mark stood and extended a hand to Emily. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant Harper." Emily took his hand, her grip firm. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, something she thought she had lost. Hope. As they left the room together, Emily couldn't help but notice the stares from staffers and officers passing by. But this time, she didn't care. Let them look. She had a mission again, and this time it wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what she had. The Pentagon's media briefing room buzzed with activity. Reporters packed the rows of chairs, their cameras and microphones ready to capture the next big headline. Emily Harper sat off to the side, trying to steady her breathing. This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes felt just as high. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," Secretary Marks said, leaning toward her. Emily met his gaze, her jaw tight. "I've been waiting years to be heard. I'm not backing down now." Parker had the illusion system back up and ready to blow. At least, he hoped they were ready. Marks nodded, stepping up to the podium. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "Good afternoon," Mark said, his voice calm but commanding. "Today we face a harsh truth. We've failed many of the brave men and women who've served this nation. Earlier this morning, Sergeant Emily Harper, a decorated Army veteran, reminded us of this failure in a way that none of us can ignore. He gestured toward Emily, who stood slowly. A murmur rippled through the room as the cameras turned to her. Her mismatched clothing and weary expression contrasted sharply with the polished officials surrounding her, making her presence all the more striking. Sergeant Harper's story is one of courage and resilience, Marks continued. But it's also a story of neglect, of a system that's left far too many behind. That ends today. The room erupted in questions, hands shooting into the air. Marks raised a hand for silence. I'll take questions after we outline our plan. He turned back to Emily. Sergeant, would you like to say a few words? Emily hesitated, her palms slick with sweat. Then she stepped forward, her shoulders squared. I didn't come here for pity, she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I came here because I'm tired of seeing my brothers and sisters in arms struggle just to survive. We fought for this country. It's time for this country to fight for us. Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea all at once. The room was silent, every reporter leaning forward as if not to miss a single word. I'm one of the lucky ones, she continued. I'm still here. But how many others aren't? How many veterans have been silenced by the weight of their struggles, their names forgotten because they didn't fit the neat, heroic narrative? Emily's voice wavered, but she pressed on. This system is broken, and fixing it isn't optional. It's a debt, one this nation owes to every person who ever put on a uniform. She stepped back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The room erupted in applause, an unexpected but welcome affirmation. Later that day, Emily found herself back in the Pentagon, seated in a smaller conference room with Marks and several high-ranking officials. Charts and briefing slides filled the screen at the front of the room, outlining the newly proposed Veteran Resilience and Support Task Force. Emily's role wasn't ceremonial. Marks had made sure of that. She was to be an active participant, ensuring the voices of veterans were heard at every step. We're already receiving calls from nonprofits and veteran advocacy groups wanting to help, said Lisa, Marks's aide. It's clear that Sergeant Harper's story has struck a nerve. Emily listened quietly, her mind racing. She had spent so long being ignored that the sudden flood of attention was overwhelming. But she pushed the discomfort aside. This wasn't about her. It was about the people still living under bridges, still fighting to be seen. As the meeting adjourned, Emily lingered, her eyes on the long list of initiatives proposed for the task force. One caught her attention, a nationwide hotline to fast-track housing and medical support for homeless veterans. Who's heading this? She asked, pointing to the item on the screen. Marks followed her gaze. We're assigning it to a team from the VA. No, Emily said firmly. I'll do it. Marks raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? It's a lot of responsibility. Emily nodded. I'm sure. I know what it's like to make those calls and hear nothing but excuses. I won't let anyone else go through that. Marks smiled faintly. Then it's yours. News of the task force spread quickly. Within days, donations poured in from private citizens, corporations, and even international organizations. Social media lit up with hashtags like Fight for Veterans and We See You, amplifying Emily's story to a global audience. Veterans began sharing their own experiences, creating a tidal wave of solidarity. Emily spent hours sifting through emails and messages, each one a reminder of the work still to be done. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt invigorated. For the first time in years, she wasn't fighting alone. One night, as she sat in the small apartment Marks had arranged for her, Emily received a video message from a group of veterans in Chicago. They had organized a rally to demand better funding for their local VA clinic. In the video, a man wearing a tattered army jacket looked into the camera. Sergeant Harper, if you're watching this, thank you. You've given us hope. Emily replayed the message 3 times, her throat tight with emotion. She hadn't set out to become a symbol, but now that she was, She would carry the weight with pride. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's role in the task force expanded. She attended town halls, spoke at fundraisers, and met with policymakers, her voice unwavering even in the face of skepticism. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with legislators, Marks approached her. "You've done more in the past month than some of us have done in years," he said. Emily shook her head. "It's not enough. Not yet." Marks placed a hand on her shoulder. "But it's a start. And sometimes that's all we need to turn the tide." "Sylvia," Emily looked at him, her resolve burning brighter than ever. "Then let's keep going." With that, she returned to her desk, already drafting her next plan of action. There was still so much to do, but for the first time she believed they could succeed. Together. The crisp autumn air carried a solemn weight as Emily Harper stood on a stage erected on the Pentagon's front lawn. Rows of chairs stretched before her, filled with veterans, military families, policymakers, and media representatives. Behind her, an oversized banner bore the words, "Veterans Resilience and Support Task Force Launch Event." She paused while taking in the thought-provoking beauty of the Pentagon's launched event. Emily adjusted the microphone and scanned the crowd. Faces of all ages looked back at her, some curious, some skeptical, but many radiating hope. She cleared her throat, drawing silence over the audience. "Good morning," Emily began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "Standing here today feels surreal. Just weeks ago I was sleeping on the steps of this building, wondering if anyone cared. I didn't expect to find myself here, let alone in front of so many of you who do." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "For years, I thought my story was mine alone. I thought no one understood what it felt like to give everything you had to your country and then be forgotten. But over the past few weeks, I've learned something important. My story isn't unique." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Emily gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles whitening. "There are thousands of veterans out there, men and women who served with honor, only to come home and face battles they never expected. Battles against poverty, mental illness, and a system that often turns a blind eye." Her voice grew stronger, more resolute. "We owe our veterans more than hollow thanks and patriotic speeches. We owe them action, accountability, change." Applause erupted, but Emily held up a hand to silence it. "This isn't just about applauding words or promises. It's about committing to the hard work ahead. That's why I'm proud to stand here today and announce the launch of the Veteran Resilience and Support Task Force. Our mission is simple. No veteran should have to fight alone. Not overseas and not here at home." Behind her, Secretary Marks stepped forward, nodding in agreement. Emily turned slightly to acknowledge him. "I want to thank Secretary Marks for not just hearing my story, but for taking action. But this isn't just his fight. It's all of ours." Her gaze returned to the crowd, locking onto a group of veterans seated near the front. Many wore their old uniforms or hats adorned with service pins. Their faces, lined with years of struggle, held expressions of cautious optimism. "We need every voice, every hand, and every heart in this fight," Emily continued. "Because change doesn't happen in conference rooms or policy briefings alone. It happens when communities rally around their own. It happens when one person says, 'enough,' and another joins them." As she stepped back from the podium, Secretary Marks returned to the microphone. "Sergeant Harper reminds us all what true service looks like," he said. "Her courage and determination have reignited a conversation this nation desperately needed, and today we take the first steps toward making things right." Marks gestured toward Emily. "On behalf of the Department of Defense, I'm honored to present Sergeant Emily Harper with the Distinguished Public Service Award for her unwavering dedication to the men and women who have served this country." A wave of applause thundered through the crowd as Marks pinned a medal to Emily's chest. She stood motionless for a moment, the weight of the honor sinking in. It wasn't just a medal. It was a symbol of validation, of being seen after so many years of invisibility. After the ceremony, Emily mingled with the crowd. Veterans approached her, some with tearful thanks, others offering handshakes and words of encouragement. One man, his voice shaking, said, "Because of you, my son might finally get the help he needs." A female walked by and clapped an interruption sign. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Emily found herself speaking with a group of young veterans eager to volunteer for the task force. Their energy was infectious, and for the first time she saw the potential for real, lasting change. "Let's make sure no one slips through the cracks," she said, her voice firm. "We're stronger together. Time to That evening, Emily stood outside the Pentagon, looking up at the building that had once symbolized her disillusionment. Now, it represented something else. A new beginning. She thought about the countless veterans still waiting for their own chance at hope, and silently vowed to keep fighting for them. As she walked toward her car, a reporter approached her. "Sergeant Harper," he called. "What's next for you?" Emily smiled faintly. "What's next?" "More work. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning." With that, she turned and walked into the night, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Emily Harper knew she wasn't fighting alone.